saw Lisa
Raining
was
here,
talking
it's
to you
like
about this, so.
Sure had some last night.
I'm
I
like,
got back.
My dog came in for the
I'm like,
first
did I
time. My
miss
dog never
something?
goes inside. It was
I didn't
so
figure it was really
Oh,
She's
but there's that
spending
document
evening
that
on the
Lisa
couch
was
with
talking
me.
to you about, if you wanna sign that.
Okay, I did this totally wrong for this.
Oh, everybody says they don't want mine.
Joel will be here, so I put yes.
Okay.
Martha's here, so I should have put yes. Fran drove herself, yes.
Yes.
So I checked yes for, I checked no for yes and no for no,
That's okay.
which made me consistent.
No.
Right in front of the
Internal tool.
auditor.
That's right.
Yeah, well, you know, I gotta give him something to catch.
That's right.
Mileage number, Dr.
Yes. Sure.
So Joel drove, Martha drove, Fran drove, Tracy drove, Peggy's not here, John is.
Oh, is this the one that Peggy has the,
Like open house.
Yeah.
this is current.
I was like,
Got it.
And this is, you good, and then the
Yes.
final one, if they send up there,
how was it? Oh, it was just fine.
It's funny for Joel not to be here early. He must have gone to the offices and come with my visit sometimes, because I haven't heard from him. He never either, have I?
High school has 5 buildings. And you're from the top.
Welcome.
Down to-
Yeah, how are you?
Good to see you, Chris.
Good.
You're basically like going at 7.
I didn't see
It's great
Fran
watching
today.
parents
No,
from
because-
science to chorus,
Why
and they
is it-
usually peter out in the middle.
I was gonna say, I think I would every day.
But they have an appreciation.
Oh, I hadn't
for
put
that
that
because
up
they're
in
doing
the
a
road.
great
Yes,
job.
exactly.
Yeah, he got back, I guess he got delayed and he ended up spending a night in Montreal, he wasn't planning on
Oh,
spending. and-
gotcha.
So, yeah.
Yeah, those long trips like that, you never can count on getting back in time.
Exactly. So, yeah, he had just gotten into the office late yesterday afternoon, so he said, yeah, it'd be better to
The house is
catch up.
it was warm out. That's it, and I got out to come here from the office, I'm like, oh, it's hot, cool out here.
Yesterday was so muggy.
I haven't been outside since this morning, so.
Me too.
It's like,
Me either, until I
I look out the
went
window
out to
and
come here, and it's like, oh, it's chilly out.
I'm not looking forward to it's dark when you leave work.
No, I hate that.
It's dark when you arrive at work, it's dark when you leave.
Leave, yep. Although a lot of times it's dark when I leave work.
Okay, if it's dark in the summer when you leave work, you are definitely working too long.
Well, sometimes.
But it happens, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
I just go home and then turn my computer on at 8 o'clock until I can't leave.
Yeah. I didn't leave last night till after.
You're not
Is
late.
everybody
I
that
do like
anxious?
that 8 to 10.
No, I think you
usually.
should.
My
Our assembly.
husband was like that fairly early.
Take your time,
and so
hang
it's
up
like,
your
it's a good
coat,
time
get
for
a
me to
coffee or tea or water
Let's
or.
water
I think
over
you're
that.
much more like that.
Mark's not here,
Yeah,
I didn't know.
You wanna do things
Put
like-
together, so.
I think he's
Journal
coming.
entries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bank records.
No.
No,
True,
coming.
no, actually, I
Oh.
wanna do true accounting.
But he didn't
Yes.
come to you, right? So that's the only other, he and the
That can
clock
get you-
are the things we're waiting for.
It's a race between.
3.0 hours of stuff. So, it makes up a
So
good
Fran, did you
program.
just get here?
Yeah,
Okay, because I knew you,
Pretty much.
she had a start time, but I could not. see. Were you?
He said, for those who are he said, yes, that works.
You gave me
Numbers.
one.
Yep,
You gave me
don't
one,
hurt
but I
you.
won't
Yep.
find you.
They don't. You might hide things,
Oh.
but they're
I
always,
don't have
the answer's
blanks,
always
but I can
there,
get
no,
on
so I can find
the
it.
Actually, before we start on that, you guys have the
Conflict of
disclosure?
interest disclosure.
Oh,
I forgot my. No, you got, you have yours, you gave me yours, so we'll ask John when he gets back and then pick.
And, you know, you can send it in.
John says,
keep going, and I'm like, fell half asleep on the way down here.
if I don't do things at the beginning, they get to the end. Chris Winter sent this PowerPoint, Bobby Joe will project it at his request, so we'll have to move to the side when they
Not
do
a
that.
chance. I sit
We
down,
can put you over
I'll
there.
manage.
And then
I'm
they
actually
ask for
capable.
paper copies, so that's
Good.
their presentation.
Got it.
And DFR approved the Act 11 changes yesterday.
Oh, so we don't have to meet?
So we need to sign the articles of incorporation to file with Secretary of State.
Each of us?
Yes,
Okay.
everybody who's here.
And.
We don't need 100%, so we don't need to worry that Peggy's not here, but we need to sign.
Did you want this?
Yes, thank you, Fran. Oh, you have to write something, even if you write none.
None?
None, and you, if you take insurance, you might wanna think about whether you write none, but that's up to you to
What do you
decide
mean
how
if I
to.
take insurance?
So, because you're on the health insurance, you might wanna note it. You can also note that it's your interest is no more than the average person, which is what the bylaws say, makes it not a conflict, but you might wanna note it. Again, it's up to you. Joe had given some possible language for somebody who's enrolled in the coverage.
File the DFR approved amendments to our bylaws with the Secretary of State. So we approved these changes last time, DFR reviewed them and said okay, and now we sign them and they go to the Secretary of
Some
State.
minutes of last time.
Yeah.
Oh, this is not a good thing. So this, how this comes still for the Burlington Film Press, is up to my, this is what I say.
And John, Tracy gave me your disclosure
Yes.
statement, so it's not missing, just so that. Okay.
I'm sorry, you need me to sign?
Yes, that's the DFR approved all of the changes due to Act 11 of all the documents we filed. So we're now ready to file with the Secretary of State. Maybe I'll just hand it to them. No, I have to go through there.
You should make a copy, just to be safe.
And we waited to sign because we say that DFR approved it, and so we want to make sure they really did before we sign it. Thank you, Fran. And we'll put these in that on my desk, so that I don't do anything weird with it.
I had a nice sleep last night, and then it's like, ugh, long day. I need to stay awake.
How's things in the office?
Crazy. Crazy.
How's that new assistant superintendent working out?
Good, actually, pretty good. Which has been super helpful, because he took a few things off of my plate, which I don't know right now with this whole staff mass exodus and e-finance thing, I don't think I would
Took all
be
the ice.
functioning if I didn't have him taking over a couple of the things that had been on my
It's
plate.
only happened once. Not that,
But,
that I
yeah.
poured an entire cup.
I miss him.
Oh, really? So I actually thought that I
I
said,
miss
So,
him in our
fear
region.
not.
Yeah,
If it happens, it will be the second time, so theoretically. it'll be-
So Tracy, has Gretchen made herself at home, or?
She is amazing and doing a great job,
Oh, good.
being a brand new principal
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's your first.
in that school without an assistant principal.
Oh.
You know, we just have principals, we don't have
Yeah.
assistants. There's a lot, she has a lot to do, but she's taking it one step at a time and,
Great.
yeah. I'm thrilled with it.
For somebody facing what you're facing, how come you're not limping? Forgive my asking.
I
So
do
if all I
want her
wanted to do was
instructional knowledge
walk
and
around a
skill.
building,
It wouldn't
I
be-
wouldn't be getting my
And what
knee
that
replaced.
brings to,
If I wanna
Conversation.
jump and hike and pick up my granddaughter and stand on my feet all day, then I don't sleep at night.
and walk up and down stairs.
So-
That's good.
Yes.
Yeah.
And long-term
Yours?
goes down the stairs.
13th.
November 4th, hip replacement.
Ah, we'll see who's.
Yeah.
August 1st, 2008.
Yeah, exactly, oh, really?
Yeah, I celebrated its 11th birthday.
Oh, wow.
hip or knee?
Mark just hold it. Okay. We have a principal in the foyer who was at a meeting downstairs who locked her keys in her truck, was waiting for
Oh, no.
a locksmith. I asked if I could help her. And anyway, she said, tell the VEHI board that VEHI is wonderful and improves the culture of our school.
Very nice.
So I assume she was talking to
Well, she
Claire
knows where
about
she's,
that.
she knows where she's waiting.
No, so I thought that, I'm reporting that. I invited her to come, but she needs to watch the locksmith, so.
Yeah.
We're all here, and I won't call for public comment until after we meet, after 4:30. Since there's nobody here, if they show up, it wouldn't be kind to have to bypass public comment before they got here. So we can call to order at 4:29, and I'll ask if there's any concern about the budget, if we should adopt it as presented.
The agenda?
I'm just testing.
I'm like, wait a minute.
It worked. We passed the test.
I almost got away with something, I don't know what it is, but okay. Are there any comments about the agenda before, if not,
I just know that we have more on the agenda than in terms of time.
I was just gonna say.
I'll let you say
it. We've got, you know, it's like every meeting that we have, and we've gone over every meeting that we've had in the last year, and really would like us not to do that. And so there are time frames here that are overly generous if we're gonna get out of here by 8. And so we're gonna dispense with with Sullivan and Powers' presentation.
Easier for me.
So, all right. Are there any comments, questions about the minutes of the August 26th meeting? Hearing none, I guess I can declare them, well, all in favor of approving the minutes
How about I
presented?
move that we approve the minutes?
You did?
And I'll
Is there a
second.
second? Martha second?
Yeah.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, that brings us to, oh no, this is the wrong one. This brings us to, finally, at long last, talking about the fiscal 19, or looks like 18 and 19
Yep.
audits. And will you just introduce yourself
Sure.
for us?
Yeah.
And understand that you have 15 minutes
I'm
to talk
on the
about
clock.
too
Oh,
much.
go.
No, we should, as a courtesy to you, make sure that you know that
That's fine.
the meeting is recorded. so
Okay.
You're on
I
camera.
appreciate that.
And I don't know if you know who we are.
I know, I have a pretty good clue who everybody is now.
Rick, this is your 15 minutes of fame.
So tell us who you are and get on with it.
All right.
Thank you for your
Uh,
understanding.
My name is Rick Brigham. I'm a partner with Sullivan Powers Company. I'm here to present the 6/30/19 audit, kind of go over it with you, show you the brief highlights of it, kind of go through the report. I've also been asked to touch a little bit on the 6/30/18 audit as well, because I think last year you guys, your agendas were so full, we were never able to really get in and kind of chat about that. I guess first off, does everybody have a copy? Because I know there's some copies here of the audit. Does everybody have copies in front with them?
There's a 19 and an 18
I think,
on it.
what I'd like to do, if we can, is just stick with the 19 and I'll reference the 18 unless somebody has specific questions.
That makes sense.
Because otherwise- And the
These
good
are
news,
the letters.
the good news is that the 19 audit shows 18's numbers comparatively.
Good.
That's also a letter.
We need a couple down here.
Here you go.
You better. Thank you. All right.
You have a letter? You have a letter?
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
You good?
So basically, you've got two documents in front of you. One of them is the actual audit report itself, and then the other one is what we call a manager letter. So I'll get into the manager letter in a little bit, but let's start off with the audit report. So I'm going to just kind of walk you through what the audit report looks like and the highlights of it. If you go to pages 1 through 2, this is the actual report itself. If you looked at this whole financial, which is 26, 24 pages long, the financial statement is really the result of management's operations here, and really the responsibility for preparation of that of this report is on management. My job is to express an opinion of that, on that financial statement, to say, you know, are these financial statements fairly stated? We basically have three choices when you come to do an opinion. You have a qualified opinion, you have an adverse opinion, or you have an unqualified. Adverse means these financial statements aren't fairly stated. Qualified means, except for this or except for that, the financial statements are fairly stated. The best report you can get is an unqualified report. And once again, both years, the VEHI obtained an unqualified report. And again, I always like to at least pass along my congratulations, because I do a lot of these presentations, and a lot of times there are adverse opinions and qualified opinions, and we always try to go forward and we figure out how to, change that in the future. But we've never had to have that issue here, and it shows the quality of the work that's done here, and how management and the board and Chris and the staff communicate to get the items done for the audit, and makes the process very smooth. So again, those first 2 pages, all I really wanted to do was outline that management's really responsible for this whole product. I help Chris put it together, or my staff does. But as far as this report, it's really the culmination of all the activities that are done, whether it's disbursements, premium collections, paying of claims liabilities, all that stuff that happens throughout the year kind of results in this audit report. One of the things I like to point out, especially for people who look at these audit reports and start to spin and say, oh my gosh, there's so much confusing stuff here, it's confusing language. If you look at pages 3 through 7, it's what we call the management's discussion and analysis. This is put together by Chris and Laura to really, it's kind of a layman's view of what happened during the fiscal year. And so if you were looking at just one section of the audit that you said, boy, I really want to get a really good understanding here without getting into all the nitty-gritty accounting terminology, I would read through those 4 or 5 pages, and you'll get a really good summary of what happened with revenues, why did things go, why were revenues either up or down, why were the expenses either up or down from the previous year. It's a really good way to kind of get a layman's perspective of what happened during the year. If I did nothing else, if I was on a board, I would be reading those pages, and I think from there you can generate questions that you may go to other sections of the audit report to look at and kind of clarify some of your questions. So if we look at page 9, or actually page 8, a lot of you are going to be familiar with what this is. Basically, we call this a statement of net position. A lot of people in the old days would have called this the balance sheet. This is basically a snapshot in time of what your assets and your liabilities look like for the VEHI organization at 6/30/19 and 6/30/18, which is why I kind of figured we didn't need to dig out the other report, because a lot of the numbers are right here as well. So as you can see, you're looking at about $53,984,000 in assets, and net position is about $41,357,000. I don't spend a lot of time with the numbers with VEHI, only because I know that a lot of times when I come into an audit report, a lot of places I go, people don't know what the numbers are going to be until they get the audit report. They say, hey, how are our numbers? But I know you guys have been pretty consistent. I read all the minutes. I kind of see the projections. It seemed like as the year was going on, you were getting pretty good solid numbers of what was happening and why it was happening, what the percentage of increases in claims and liabilities related to. So I don't think there's any surprises in the numbers that are appearing in the audit report from any of the information that you've been getting throughout the year.
I'm gonna pause if I may
Yep,
and say
sure.
one thing, because this is always sort of gets people. This is our health and dental program.
Yeah.
So when you look at the numbers and you say, wait a minute, that seems different than I remember when we talked about the health rate last time. There's actually an exhibit now that breaks out health and dental at
In
the
the
end,
back,
we
yeah.
added for convenience.
Exactly, yeah, and if you were to kind of look back on pages 23 and 24, you can see what Laura's talking about. There's a schedule that takes this exact, exhibits A and B, and basically breaks them out for health and dental so that you can get to see those breakouts. And if I looked at pages 11 through 19, we call those the notes to the financial statements. So what we have is we have the opinion, we have the MD&A, we have the the income statement, balance sheet, and then we have the notes, the financial statements, which if you're looking to find out more information about, Visbit's relationship with VEHI, the contracts between them, you're looking to find out more about the cash, investment balances, and securities related to that, and a little bit more disclosure on that, that's where you'll find much more detail back here through the working fund deposit, what makes up other receivables, information on claims payable. So if you're trying to deep dive on any one particular item, these footnotes are a great place to go. So that's pretty much the setup of the audit report and how it goes. And like I said, last year's wasn't too much different than that. Obviously, a lot of the process of what we did and how we audited and a lot of the procedures, there were no major changes in audit requirements related to this year. So a lot of what we did this year was similar to last year. The report was similar to last year, so no big changes there. As far as the other letter that you received, you got a letter, it's a 2-pager. It's what we call the manager letter. As required under our standards, once we do an audit report, we're also required to communicate to you, material weaknesses or significant deficiencies that we find in the course of performing the audit. We go one step further than that. We add one another layer to it and report other recommendations. That's kind of like, hey, just things to think about, things that we might talk about during the audit procedures process. So of those three layers, we actually, you'll see there's nothing attached to it because we didn't come up with anything this year. There was nothing where we felt like there had to be anything additional. A lot of that comes probably from the communication that Chris and I and Laura have during the year. If things happen, if there's changes in programs or changes in situations, a lot of that stuff is run by during the year and dealt with during the year. So it's not like I'm coming in with this big surprise or big change or big. So I'm usually coming in with with my eyes open, and a lot of any of the changes are right there. So there weren't any real recommendations, and obviously again the highlight from that is no material weaknesses and no significant deficiencies. And again, that's to be congratulated because a lot of my clients that's just not the case. So and that again is a testament to the staff here. So
Well done, staff.
the other thing
I don't think any of us is surprised. Well done.
the last thing I wanted to kind of communicate. In here, I'm going to leave these with Laura. These are letters to the board. Basically, it's a last letter. I don't like to give it out ahead of time because some people get it confused with the management letter. They look at it and they like. So this is basically a letter of required communications to the board, basically saying, hey, nobody forced us to do anything. Nobody did. We had no disagreements with management. We had no issues with management. This will talk about, actually during the audit, I think we actually only had one adjustment during the audit, which I believe was related to claims and Express Scripts, right?
Oh, it was
Yes.
it was the remedy, it's the Express Scripts audit.
Yeah.
And how we expect a rebate or return at some point, and we need to book that even though we haven't gotten it yet.
Yeah.
So we had to talk through how to capture that we have an expectation of money coming from that at some point.
And again, so that letter will just mention that one adjustment that we did. But again, it was it's always weird to say it was a proposed adjustment because it really comes down with Chris and Laura and I sitting down and talking through things and saying, oh geez, if there's an estimate there, we probably should book it. And so it's kind of a joint kind of communication and getting to that number and means communicating with the outside vendors and getting a good estimate for that. But that was really the only adjustment that we had to post. And so those required communications are all in that letter. So with that being said, I've got 2 minutes to take questions.
Seeing none, are there any questions? Really quickly.
Yeah, I have one quick one.
Yep.
It's one that we've, I think, asked before, but as a firm that's audited us for several years,
Yep.
can you briefly explain to the board, which has several new members, what are the structures and processes in place to help us be sure that you are applying fresh and thorough eyes to our audit process?
Okay, and what we've done in the past, because we're actually a fairly good-sized firm for the area. I have 3 partners, and 2 of the partners are actually audit partners. And what we've done over the years is exchange roles in this. Like, I have a partner who's actually a little bit involved in this all the time because he reviews the financials, and that's just what he does for a lot of our audit, pretty much all our audit reports, just the way the firm works. But we always are trying to, over the span of whatever it's 2, 3, 4 years, rotate the partners in and out of here, rotate staff in and out of here. Sometimes Chris doesn't like when the staff gets rotated because it means they do have fresh perspective and fresh questions and ideas, and boy, I hadn't thought about that, or just different ideas. And even if they're new staff, sometimes just new staff come in with all sorts of ideas, and they make you take a harder look as you're educating them about how to go out and do audits and how to proceed. And so even those little questions can sometimes say, hey, that's not a bad audit step to add to this. And so between that, training courses that we take, and always rotating procedures, and one of the things we try to always do is add additional procedures every year, rotate procedures every year, to just look at more different functional areas a little bit more one year than another. You know, a lot of years I'll get really into, you know, a lot of the things that I think, you know, DFR is going to look at, whether it's compliance or with the laws and regulations. And so I'll spend a lot more time on that than necessarily on some of the number crunching that I can let my staff do. But the best thing that we can do for that is really the rotation of the audit partners, and really gear up for that as a group before we come in and say, how are we going to do this differently? That's just how we audit. So it's just kind of a function of the process. So.
Thank you. We are out of time for this. If you want to take
I was just gonna say, about how many years have you been doing the audit?
I can't.
Number of years.
This is your
Probably-
last year, we kick you off as a particular audit.
Oh, this is, yes, yeah, this is my 3rd year, so. yes.
But the firm has been doing it since inception.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's 3 main audit partners and we've had all 3 go
Yeah.
through.
I don't like the word being kicked off, but okay.
I'm sorry.
That didn't seem like the way to end, that didn't seem like the way to end this.
Transfer,
You will not
transfer.
find your name at
Hey,
the
that's just the
front of
beginning,
the
Rick,
letter.
because I get to kick you out.
Wow.
Rick, thank you very much.
Thank you
I
very much.
appreciate
We need to take
how quick, I appreciate how quickly you were able to present a lot of information in a very short period of time and convey appropriately the quality, the high quality of the work on the part of the staff here all at the same time. And maybe next time we can have you for 18, 19 minutes. Or whoever follows in your steps.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good to see everybody.
If you don't mind taking that cup out of here so nobody accidentally
I'm
drinks
gonna
it.
take care of it.
Because you know.
We take action to accept.
I was going to say, my understanding is there's no need for board action on the audit, and so I won't ask for any, and we'll move on.
You don't think the minutes should show the board accepted the audit report?
You can accept it, but you can't approve it, because you don't approve it.
Is there a motion to accept?
I
the
move that we
report?
accept it.
I second that.
Moves, John seconds. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Moving on, thank you very much. Chris, I don't know how to say this to you, but we're about to yield the floor to you again, appropriately, so that you can talk with us about our investment policy as the representatives of the Secretary of State's office make their way into the building. I'm not sure they're coming here first, so why don't you just proceed?
Okay, so, all of our funds are held at People's Bank or Vanguard Group, or the People's Trust. And so our, People's Bank, that's our regular cash account. What happens is it sweeps out every night, any unused earnings sweep over to the trust account, and that's in a Dreyfus account currently, money market. And then we have a separate investment account over at Vanguard, where what we consider to be more the reserves that we will not be touching live. So our policy refers to a couple of classes, that's the way they've named it, Class A and Class B. So Class A are the funds that are in the checking account at People's, and that sweep out to Dreyfus into the money market. We're looking at a decline in those returns recently. Most of last year, it was running around 2.2 to 6%, but because of the economy, it's at 0.01% currently. And that's what happens when the feds start doing what the feds sometimes do. And there isn't a lot of confidence at that level. So unfortunately, money markets, you know, while they're safe, you don't have a lot of great returns on money market accounts. Then we have our Class B funds, which are invested in the Vanguard Short-Term Bond Index Fund for most of FY19. In March, we moved 25% of that into the Total Stock Market Index Fund. And that was a process that we worked for quite a while on. It was something that the board had approved as part of policy, that we could start into the equities. And then we ended up here at Visbit having an outside investment advisor come in. So we were able to get some information from that study as well, which VEHI could benefit from. And ended up moving that, and that truly made a huge impact on our returns. Having that money in equities compared to bonds is huge. And so basically when you're looking at the return for the first 9 months of the year, which was bonds only, it was 1.6% rate of return. And with that mixed portfolio over the last 3 months, we were at around 5%. So you can see that that made a big, big difference. And then attached, one of the benchmarks that we look at is that we at least want to exceed CPIU. And so this is a basic graphic which shows on the bar graph the CPI, our actual rate of return for the prior 12 months as of each quarter, and then what the variance is. So for example, as of 6/30/19, we exceeded CPIU by 3.4%. And as you can see, in the first couple of quarters, the prior 12 months, we were actually not keeping up with CPIU, and that was because of our investments only being in the bond arena. It gives you a much more balanced portfolio. I mean, there are times when bonds and equities usually don't move the same way at the same time. So it certainly gives you a much more balanced portfolio to have some money in equities. I think I took 15 minutes. Any questions?
Seeing none, this is going to be my mantra. Are there any questions? Seeing none, do we accept this report? Is there any reason to accept this report?
Sure.
Somebody move forward?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? We have accepted the report, and I've lost my agenda.
While Joe's looking for his agenda and before he moves,
It's a hidden agenda.
we are taped. The School Boards Association posts these on their website as part of their notice, so just
Here we
to
are.
let,
All right, I'm all set.
not that you're not used to it.
Okay,
In the public eye.
now,
I was in front of the cameras today.
so most of you folks know, and I'm not sure Jim knows, but Chris certainly knows. This next hour has been, I won't say years, but months in the making. I first approached Chris last spring about this and got an immediate, just tell us when and we'll show up. And so ultimately we told them when and they showed up. It was very impressive. We had an hour allocated to this. I thought I should at least introduce our guests and then we can go around the room. Jim Condos is our State Secretary of State in the middle of your 5th term, if I'm not mistaken. And that's relevant to the presentation here, but you should all know that as a state senator, Jim was a member and ultimately chair of both the Education Committee and the Government Operations Committee, which have fundamental roles in the life that most of us, all of us, engaged in outside of this. At least I did before I retired anyway. Chris Winters is the Deputy Secretary of State, and I first came into contact with Chris in like 05 or 06 when he was the director of what's called the Office of Professional Responsibility.
Regulation.
I'm sorry, the Office of Professional Regulation, which basically oversees the licensing of almost, but not quite all professions in the state. And that was the year that we were seeking the establishment of the Professional Standards Board. And at the time, the Secretary of State was not Jim Condos. thought that that office was busy enough and decided it was best to leave teacher licensing in the then Department of Education. And there may have been a change of heart more recently than that, but that's how Chris and I came into contact with each other. These gentlemen know what they're doing. Chris has been with the Secretary of State's office for like a quarter century.
It's kind of scary when you say that. 22 years.
Jim is a former elected representative, person in the South Burlington community. And Chris is, I think, off now, the school board at, right nearby here.
The Berlin Elementary School Board,
Okay.
which is
Across the
basically no
street.
more.
Can't get
Down the
closer
street.
than that.
But until just the change, the merger?
I got off in March before, just this past March. Yeah.
And I won't bore you with how Jim and I first met, but if there's time later, I will. It has to do with
Oh,
an Act 60 presentation in South Burlington. With that,
That was a previous life.
it was for both of us. I will yield the floor. We have a PowerPoint presentation for which I have to move, I believe. And as you all know, they have a series of questions, many of which were reminiscent of one another to get to. All before 6 o'clock, or actually before 5 or 6, if we can.
receipt, you can have receipt to it.
So I'll move in a second once I get my, so.
Yeah, that's good.
But be my guest, gentlemen. Thank you both for showing up. This is a unique event in the life of this board. And occasioned by, I think, more than anything else, by the fact that VEHI was not a public body until a number of years ago.
So that was one of my questions, if I could.
2014?
13.
13.
So it is a public body, it's a nonprofit.
It's an intermunicipal association under Title 24.
Title 24,
And it is defined within the definition of public body.
And our legal counsel has indicated that not only do we need to be mindful of nonprofit law, but also municipal open meeting law, as well as, since we're made up of school districts, our members are school districts, we need to be mindful of that as well. So we're
Just a
at,
few things to pay attention to.
we're
yeah.
close to we're at.
I guess so.
So, are we gonna go around the room just?
Should I start? Why don't we start with Laura?
Laura Soares, school board member in Randolph for many years. I got off quite a few years ago back then. And I'm currently the president of ISBIT and support VEHI, who has no employees. Just to make it more interesting.
Chris Roberts, I'm business manager of finance, so obviously do all the financial work for VEHI as well.
I'm Martha Donnelly, I'm a board member, I come from St. Albans, Naperville.
Fran Brock, I'm on board. I'm a history teacher at Burlington High School.
Mark Cage, Director of Benefit Programs at Vermont NEA, and a member of the VEHI Management Team.
Hi, I'm Bobby Jo Sauls, and I work for the VEHI Management Team as well.
I'm Tracy Rend, I'm from a while south, and I have been on this board since it became an intermunicipal insurance association, whenever that was.
I'm John Kendall, I'm the superintendent in Barry and a member of the school.
Joel Cook, I'm tired. But I've been a sometime member of this board for probably 18 years, with the gap of the last 2.5 before this.
So Joel spoke a little bit about it. I served 18 years on the South Burlington City Council. The last 8 of those years, I was the chair of the city council. I went to Burlington High School until my sophomore year, and then we moved to South Burlington. And at which point, we immediately, because of what was going on in the Burlington area, South Burlington actually, my principal and vice principal from Burlington became teachers in South Burlington. John Hart, I forget, Reg Godin was my vice principal. So he became a legislator, and I remember seeing him in the hallway, and I got really nervous. But he was our disciplinary vice principal. So I served 18 years in South Burlington, 8 years in the state senate. I was on I chaired education. Joel and Jeff and Andy and
When he says Jeff, he means Jeff Francis.
No, well, Jeff Francis, but Jeff Bannon as well. I mean, it was, I remember we were having, this is just an aside, we were having a little discussion about school choice or something, or charter schools. And Hull Maynard, may he rest in peace, just recently passed away, but Hull Maynard, who was a gentleman, insisted, he asked me if he could have John McClary come in to speak about it. So I said, sure, why not? So he came in and I had Joel sitting on one side, Andy Snyder on the other side, and as John McClary is talking, the two of them are handing me notes. Why are you letting him say that? Why are you? And I said, just let him speak.
I would never say such a thing.
And we let them speak, and then when they left, they both attacked me and said, why'd you do that? And I said, you can't accuse me of not letting him speak. And that was the whole idea, was just to let him have his say. But in any case, I was chair of education, then I was chaired government, I was on government operations, and ended up chairing that committee, which oversees most of the work that the Secretary of State's office does. And then I left, thought I was all done with politics, and Deb Markowitz asked me to run, so I did. But in any case, we are where we are. I've been a strong supporter. I've known Laura for years now via the Senate Education and whatever. But we've been really pushing hard on open meeting law and actually public records access as well among government entities in the state of Vermont. And we've got it down pretty good. We know this is it's a fairly short presentation, but it's about 22 slides, but it has the high level discussion, and you know, we'll go through. I think the best thing is to go through it first, and then if you have any questions, you have a copy of this, so you can write your questions along the
I'll
slide.
just say, you submitted some really good questions already. We appreciate having those in advance. I'll tell you that you're in the gray areas of the law, and there's quite a bit of gray area in this law. So I just want to kind of set expectations tonight that you're not going to get legal advice from us tonight. That's what you have legal counsel for. But we can talk to our experiences, what other public bodies are struggling with, what we think the law means, where you're possibly in the clear, where you're not. But please don't take this as legal advice. That's why you have your own counsel. I'm required to say that. But you're
For about
struggling.
20 years, I've been in the gray. So.
You're struggling with the very same things that a lot of public bodies are struggling with, and these are great questions that you've asked, and we'll get to them.
So who's manning the presentation?
Bobby Joe.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, all right, I just want to know when I'm ready.
All
right.
So, we started in 2011, we started doing the transparency tour. We go around the state. We do at least 12 stops. It's every other year. It's the non-election year. We try to get to locations around the state so that no town is any further than about an hour away from at least 2 locations. So we set it up in that manner around the state. We've done now over 50. We do it, as I said, every other year. And you know, we have some small groups. We've done it before 2 people, and we've done it through before when St. Johnsbury was having a few problems. There was 160 people showed up. And in fact, the Caledonia Record on that day issued a editorial that said that if Secretary Kondo shows up to give this presentation on open meeting law and all 5 members of the the select board are not there, they should call the sheriff's department and go round them up. That was pretty damning for that area. But in any case, so why are we here? We're here because of democracy, accountability, and openness. The public, and I'm going to say this often tonight, the public has a right to know, even if there's no public independence. The open meeting and public records law protects our direct access to the decisions that affect us, and understanding these laws makes everyone a better citizen. This is the Constitution, Chapter 1, Article 6. All power being originally inherent in and consequently derived from the people, Therefore, all officers of government, whether legislative or executive, you notice there's no judiciary there, are their trustees and servants, and at all times in a legal way accountable to them. In government, the ultimate boss is the public. There are these two citations that you see here. One is, the 311 is the Declaration of Public Policy for the open meeting law, and the second one, 315, is for open records. But in both cases, you will see that they talk about the people's business, and that we're accountable to the people. And in the public records, even though such examination may cause inconvenience or embarrassment, and that was actually cited in a Supreme Court case. Next slide. So open meeting law, you can go on, it's a very short section, 310 to 314 in Title I. Who must comply? Public bodies of the state and its municipalities, state and municipal boards, councils, and commissions, and any committees or subcommittees of those bodies. Not included are individual officials, councils established by the governor, exclusively for policy, and judicial branch, public service board, and it says nonprofits generally. And that is because generally nonprofits do not have to follow, even if they get 100% of their funding from the state or the feds, but there are occasions where the strings that are attached say you do have to follow. And that's VPT, Vermont Public Television, ran into that a few years ago. You might remember it was in the paper. They were not following open meeting law. Someone challenged them. They said they didn't have to because they were a nonprofit. Lo and behold, their funder, it was the Center for Public Broadcasting, had a clause in there that said you must follow the open meeting law for your state. So,
And this is why we're a public body. I don't know if we clarified it before, but irrespective of the composition of the board, the organization itself is a membership organization in school districts. So it's,
Okay.
Yeah, we're considered an instrumentality of the municipalities because we basically operate
Yeah.
a program that's an extension of their operations.
it'd be like regional planning, metropolitan planning, any of those organizations. So when does the open meeting law apply? Anytime a quorum holds a meeting. What's a quorum? A majority of the public body, of the entire public body. What's a meeting? A gathering of a quorum of the public body for the purpose of discussing business of the public body or taking any action. And those are two key points. I mean, the first question we always ask when people ask us, does this organization need to follow the open meeting law? The first question we always have to say is, are they a public body? Once you determine whether they're a public body or not, then you have to go to, okay, what's the board membership? If it's 11, then you know that the quorum is 7. If it's, I'm sorry, yeah, 7. And if it's, 5, then the quorum would be 3. So, and then it's whether they are meeting to discuss the business of that board.
So can I ask a question? The VEHI board actually has a unique quorum definition in their bylaws, which they follow. But if you have a committee, you talked about a committee of the board, and the committee doesn't constitute a quorum, let's say it's a committee of 2 board members, it might have other people, staff with it, it's subject to open meeting law,
Any committee is subject to open meeting law.
regardless
And
of the
the
quorum.
the quorum is, if, let's just say it was your quorum for this group is 7, let's just say. But your subcommittee, whether it be a finance committee or what, is, say, only 3, it's not the members of the larger board, it's not the quorum of the larger board, it's the members of what that board's body makeup is, the committee makeup is. So if the body is, it would be 2 for 3.
do I understand correctly that if a board appoints a committee consisting of its members and other people, the other people count towards the quorum and stuff, the committee?
Yeah, it's not a quorum of the people on the main board, which I think that does,
Right.
people
So
do
the
get confused by that.
committee doesn't have authority to do its business unless it has a quorum of its committee, and in which case it's a public body.
Correct.
It's not a meeting without a quorum.
Yeah, and I think one of the questions that was asked was, did this change at some point. I think what we saw in our office and what the legislature saw was that boards were abusing this. Not a lot, but it was happening where they would appoint these subcommittees to go off and do all kinds of work, come back to the larger body's meeting, and the public wouldn't have had any opportunity for input or to hear those discussions or deliberations. So they were kind of hiding some of their business behind closed doors with subcommittees. So I think the definition was reworked to say, it's any subdivision, any subcommittee of the public body is still the public body.
That was my question. I asked, is there some historical reason why our bylaws might have said the number of people at a committee is less than a quorum? So apparently we were part of that.
If we said that there were members of this board who meet to prepare the agenda, but their job is to prepare the agenda, if we call them an executive committee, does that mean they are now a committee and they are, because they're not, is that doing the business of the board? And I ask because I'm actually dealing with that in my own system right now.
Outside of this work.
But I think it's relevant.
I just note we're not following your directions. To hold questions to the end.
That's fine, I don't care which way we do it.
I went off on that.
But that's never happened.
You're all educators, so.
I understand completely.
Yeah, I have no issue with taking the questions as we go.
Okay.
It's just that I know that if we do, we may not get through the whole thing, so if you can keep it to just short questions. As to your question, I think,
Meeting, here's a definition of meeting right
oh,
there.
there you go.
Organize an
If
agenda.
it's just about the agenda, then you're okay.
Yeah, so,
But
and
it's
it
still-
doesn't matter
it's still-
where the meeting is being held. And that is really about, because we always hear that, there were the three selectmen went to the coffee house on Saturday morning. And they were discussing stuff. Well, as long as the stuff they were discussing had nothing to do with the town business, they were okay. If they were talking about the Patriots or the Giants or the Red Sox, they're fine. It's when they cross the line and start talking about business. The other thing we had one time was, with regard to that, was we had I had a reporter call me because she had been at a meeting of the select board. I was up in the Northeast Kingdom. The meeting adjourned. And she was in the back of the room, and they apparently didn't see her back there, and they started talking with the treasurer about the budget and all this stuff, and the full quorum was still there. And they're talking with the treasurer, and all of a sudden someone saw her and said, oh, wait a minute, if we have any questions for the treasurer, deal with it one-on-one. So she called me, she said, was that a legal meeting? And I said, well, let me ask you a question. Was it a quorum of the board? Yes. Were they discussing business that pertains to them? Yes. Then if they had adjourned and they were still talking.
Could you back up one slide? So when we're talking about what is a meeting, I think this is another one of the big questions that you have, is perhaps, whether you're just preparing for a meeting or you're sending a lot of information about the meeting, that email to everyone. And then the danger of the reply all. It's at that point you're discussing the business of the body as a quorum. So those big emails are in preparation for a meeting, happen all the time. It's passing out information, but there's a real danger there in having someone reply back or beginning a conversation outside of that open meeting without the public there, without anyone taking minutes.
And in the next slide, we'll talk about that as well.
Before you do it, it's just about these committee questions there's always a lingering. All right, so let's be sort of,
Open.
no, I mean, real. Tracy and I sort of co-chair this. We're often in touch with Laura and Mark, and sometimes including Bobby Joe.
But we aren't on the board.
I'm not asking, I know they know that. Nevertheless, we talk certainly about more than just an agenda item. Is that a committee? And if so, the heck are we supposed to do?
Have you been appointed as a committee? Did this
No,
full
that's-
board
that's
say
really the
you are a
question.
committee?
No, that's really the question. All right, on the other hand, Tracy and I are elected chair and vice chair, and with designated joint responsibilities. Are we a committee? So the word committee is important. Okay.
It's really whether it's a sanctioned committee by the board.
Okay, that's
So
very
if the
helpful.
board designates a committee, the city of Burlington actually, they used to have these 3-member, have a 14-member, city council. And they would have these 3-member subcommittees, 3-member finance, 3-member
Right.
ordinance, 3-member whatever. And they didn't think they had to follow the law, the open meeting law, because they thought, well, there's not a quorum of our board. It doesn't matter, it's what that sanctioned board, if that's a sanctioned committee and it has a specific membership, then that's the membership. So getting back to your thing about the executive committee, I would say to you that my personal feeling is, and this would probably be argued if you get the attorneys in the room, but my personal feeling is that if it's an executive committee that's designated by the board, and it has specific members on that executive committee, then it is a subcommittee of the board.
Calling it a council obviously doesn't make any difference.
No matter what you call it.
It
You can't
doesn't
call it a
matter.
work
But
session either.
But if you say we're not gonna have the committee, but again, the chair and the co-chair are gonna meet for the purposes of developing and preparing the agenda.
And if your executive committee is bigger than that, and it's only 2 members, then I don't see where that would be a quorum of that committee. So whatever, I mean, typically an executive committee is usually the current chair, the past chair, vice chair, I don't know, who else, secretary, treasurer, or whatever. So you might have 4 or 5 members on it, so that would be your designated committee, and you would have, whatever, if it's 5, then 3 is a quorum. So if you have 3 or more, you gotta meet the open meeting law. If it's less than 2 or less than 3, then you're probably fine. But I just wanna caution you because, again, about the spirit of the open meeting law is that the public has a right to know. So the second point, a meeting can come together over a span of time. Watch out for email strings and social media discussions. We once had an city attorney from down south that called us up and said, the rec committee is made up of a bunch of young people and they want to hold online chat room. They want to hold meetings in their chat room. And they asked us, they asked VLCT, their attorney did not agree with it. VLCT didn't, and neither did we, because we said that really is limiting the people who have access to that, and it doesn't take into account that other people who don't have access might have it.
Unless that gathering is warned, right? I mean,
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing, you also gotta warn them, those meetings. But the point I wanted to make is, using social media, Facebook, because we see this often where a group, a city might have a Facebook page, and they get on and they start interacting with public, and it's all the members are sitting there talking, or they talk amongst themselves on Facebook. Yeah, it's public, but it's still not, in a sense. And, the same thing happens with email strings, and that's why this last bullet, or set of bullets, came out of, was it 2 years ago? The legislature actually clarified it, that communications to schedule a meeting, organize the agenda, or distribute materials, not a problem, that's not considered a meeting. It's if you start discussing those otherwise, that you start to run into problems. Clerical work and staff work assignments, routine day-to-day administrative, site inspections, that's more like listers and stuff, and then quasi-judicial deliberations, which would be like zoning board. A meeting does not include occasions when a quorum of the public body attends a social gathering, conventions, conferences, training programs, press conferences, media events, or otherwise gathers, provided that the public body doesn't get together and start discussing specific business. A gathering of a quorum of a public body at a duly warned meeting of another public body. So we get this often because the planning commission might be meeting with the select board to go over the town plan. And do they have to warn both? No, as long as if it's the select board meeting and the select board warns that meeting, it says that the planning commission will be in attendance and why, that's all they need to do. Next. So there are 3 types of meetings: regular meetings, special meetings, and emergency meetings. Now, I don't know, I assume that you have a regularly scheduled meeting, no? Okay.
No, but the
We
bylaws.
schedule our meetings.
They get scheduled in advance and noted on the website as soon as one is scheduled, usually a month or more in advance.
Okay,
But
so-
the bylaws allow,
In that case, I would consider that to be a special meeting. A regular meeting would be like the select board meets on the first and third Wednesdays of each month at 7 PM at City Hall.
I see.
And any change to those factors, first and third Wednesday, 7 PM in City Hall, if any one of those things changes, then it falls to a special meeting. A regular meeting, you have to post your agenda at least 48 hours ahead. A special meeting, 24 hours ahead, and obviously any of the appropriate newspaper, radio stations serving the area. If anybody has asked for notice, oftentimes with school boards or city councils or select boards, someone, it could be the press, will say, anytime you're gonna meet, I would like to have a notice that you're meeting. And that typically is, if you send it in writing to a board between January and the end of November, it's good for that whole calendar year, no matter when you do it. If you do it in December, it's good for the rest of that calendar year and the next calendar year.
Question. I'm not suggesting we change our practice, but I don't think we've worried about the word regular or special, we just have meetings.
Yeah,
And we have provided at least, typically a full week's advance notice.
You're fine.
That's beyond what the law requires, okay.
We don't have to say special on the heading of our agenda.
no, as long as you're just noticing it, I mean, if you had regular meetings, meeting the first Monday of every month, and people knew that, that was what you adopted as a policy, as a resolution in the beginning, and then you start changing, oh, there's a holiday on this Monday, so we better put it to Tuesday or the next Monday, then you start to get into it, but as long as you're notifying, as long as your agenda is posted, at least, in this case, 24 hours notice, you're fine. Emergency meetings, this probably can get,
Have we ever had one in our history, in the 6-year public body?
but let me give you an example. I mean, in 2011, September of 2011, there were hundreds of emergency meetings going on around the state of Vermont. Hurricane Irene hit.
Yeah.
You had select boards that were meeting at the culvert, at the bridge, at the road washout, different places every day, trying to figure things out. So you have to give some public notice as soon as possible before the meeting, even if it's 10 minutes before, depending on what's going on. You might be at the culvert and Public Works said, hey, we've got another culvert that's out. Okay, we're moving over to that one. As long as it's publicly discussed. It's supposed to be for unforeseen occurrences requiring immediate attention. My old city, South Burlington, had fairly recently in the last year called a emergency meeting to sign some documents on a Friday. Their regular meeting was Monday, they forgot to sign the documents. So they called an emergency meeting on Friday. I called the town manager who I know, and I just said, you know, that's not really an emergency meeting, because you could have, how soon did you know that you had to do this? He said, oh, at least 2 days. And I said, you could have called it a special meeting, that's really what it is. An emergency meeting is that where you really, the building's on fire, we gotta do something. Or we had an 18-inch snowfall.
Basically, it's imminent, right?
That's right.
Okay, yeah.
Question on regular place, and I'm sorry to speak.
Yep,
too
that's
much,
all right.
With newly merged districts, that many have decided to rotate their meetings around, if there's a schedule, or if, you know, September is always in this school and October is always in this school, is that still a regular meeting if it's somewhere posted?
I would say yes.
As long as there's adequate notification.
Typically, what I recommend, and not everybody does this, but what we used to do is, you know, because we used to move our meetings sometimes in South Burlington from one school to another school to the city hall or whatever. Anytime we posted an agenda, we would have a location. List of what's. And if you're doing it 48 hours ahead, everybody knows, or 24 hours ahead. Okay.
All right, we didn't, you want to go this one,
Well, we can go over this real quick. So agendas, this is kind of a summary. Regular meetings at least 48 hours ahead, posting agendas, 24 hours a meeting, 24 hours for a special meeting, where on a website, if the public body maintains one or designates one, for municipal bodies only, in or near the town clerk's office and 2 other designated places. And it must be made available to anybody that calls or asks for it prior to the meeting.
So it's a good question, are you a municipal body, and would you have to do it in each of the towns represented here?
So our attorney said no.
Got it.
Advised us, have it on our website,
Don't answer.
make it available to any person if asked. But we have,
Got it.
every single municipality in the state is a member.
Ah, well, there you go.
So,
So post it
If you
every.
notice,
so
it's a
to
waste
kind
of
of,
paper.
Academic.
What we always do with our, what I used to do when I was chair of the city council, and what is actually written in statute now in the last 3 or 4 years, is that the agenda should address specific topics to be discussed and any potential actions. Because sometimes you should see some of the agendas that we see out there, there might be 3 words per line. Discuss budget, discuss this, you know, and it doesn't, or it just says budget, or, you know, capital, or whatever. And there's just no information whatsoever, so the public has no knowledge really of what is going on. You gotta provide some information so the public knows what it is going to be discussed. The first act of business should be, are there any changes to the agenda? Any additions or deletions? And the last, and then any other adjustment can be made during the meeting as you go. And what we used to do is have any changes to the agenda right up front. Second item on our agenda used to be, does the public have anything they want to comment on that has nothing to do with the rest of the agenda?
It's in the next slide, but could you talk a little bit about executive sessions and whether those should be on the agenda?
Yeah, that's an ongoing argument between, sorry, I'm not an attorney, between attorneys as to whether an executive session needs to be listed on your agenda. If you know there's a good chance, put it on your agenda.
And to the extent that you could describe the topic, put it on the agenda.
Yeah, it's kind of hard when you're, you know, one camp says, how do we know if we're gonna go into an executive session until we actually start discussing the topic? We don't know if we need to go into executive session. That's one of the arguments. So, because some people say, well, they didn't warn an executive session. They may not have had a need to when they put the agenda together, but something came up during the meeting that they realized they needed to go into executive session to discuss.
would it suffice if when an agenda is drawn up that one of the last items is executive session if needed?
That would be fine.
But not as a standing item.
I would prefer that, yeah, I think as a standing item, it's not a great idea, because then people really have no knowledge that, you know, and sometimes, I'm just trying to think how we used to do it. We used to have it on our agenda, and it would say, after on the item that we were discussing, agenda, executive session may be needed, or something like this. If we were talking about a personnel issue.
I think one of the questions that had come up, and I think it ties back to the embarrassing or inconvenient comment before, is can you go into executive session to discuss whether or not you need to go into executive session?
No.
No.
That discussion is supposed to happen in the public.
Right.
Can I go back?
That would be wrong.
Can I go back to just?
Sure.
You had indicated the very first thing should be changed to the agenda before public comment. So if we have public comment before, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't really matter.
And should there be action to adopt the agenda? Or if you just say, are there changes? And
You have an agenda that's been posted, so
Yep.
that's an official agenda. And if you say, are there any changes to that agenda, and there's none, then that's your agenda going forward. You don't need to adopt it.
if you make changes, should
If
there
you-
be action?
Well, often, I mean, what I used to say was, is there any objection to this change? Or is there an objection, like the city manager might come to us and say, I need to talk to you about a liquor license. And we would say, okay, add it under item number 5, is there any objection to adding it? And with the understanding that there would be no action taken.
Item 5 here was about the audit, so that's good, that's not liquor.
But the other piece of this is, if you're adding something to the agenda, it should not be something that requires an action. Because you haven't warned it, so nobody knows that you're gonna take that action. So if you added something to the agenda that, because otherwise it could get abused, and it could be, I don't wanna say it.
We've heard it all.
You know, we've heard it all, and
It's a way to keep people from attending the controversial topic. You
Right.
don't
Or
post
not.
it, you throw it on.
Right.
So what you're saying, don't add action items to the agenda?
no, but you can add an item that needs action at the next.
As long as you don't take action.
Right.
Got it.
To advance the discussion.
Because
To
we've
get it
seen,
started.
we've seen meetings where a board knows there's gonna be someone from the public who's gonna object. They get to the meeting, like, oh, that person's not here,
Too late.
let's
Let's
add
add it.
something to the agenda. And unfortunately, that happens.
You'd be surprised what happens.
No, that's a nuance.
So minutes, this has raised a lot of ruckus over the last few years since the legislature actually clarified, but, and I'm gonna actually say up front that really nothing has changed with the exception of adding that if you have a website, you have to add it to your website. But your minutes, this has been in law for years, true indication of the business of the meeting, covering all topics and motions. At a minimum, you wanna list who the members are that are present, any active participants, any motions, proposals, or resolutions, and the disposition of those, any vote results, and individual votes if there was a roll call. When, they must be posted no later than 5 calendar days after the meeting. That's been in law for over 30 years. And it'll be, at the bottom, you can see, made available for inspection and copying upon request, posted to a website if the public body maintains or designates one. So that, everything to that last bullet has basically been in law for years. It was just adding that last bullet. And we had towns all over the states threatening to pull down their websites because it couldn't meet the 5 days. Well, you had to meet it before, but you just weren't. So, anyway.
One of the questions I asked was, and I'm not sure where this came from, and I'm not even, I think it's probably not even a VEHI thing, but I was up here for some reason. The minutes are supposed to include true indication, including all motions. And so my question was, if a business item that should be recorded in the minutes doesn't make it into the minutes, and the public body, in approving the minutes, doesn't amend it, doesn't correct it, what's the resort? What is there that anybody can do?
I can give them a good example.
As long as my
I go-
name
I
isn't
go back-
attached to it, go ahead.
I go back to South Burlington all the time. I live in Montpelier now. But I was chair of the city council for 8 years. And over the course of time, Chuck Hafter, our city manager, had been around for 18 years. He always insisted, for instance, whenever he negotiated a contract with our labor unions, whether it was police, fire, public works, or city staff, that he would get no more of a increase than they would. So that was just his policy, that's what he wanted. So we found other ways to take care of him. We might give him a bonus every once in a couple of years or something, or we might pay for additional contribution to his retirement. So you go into executive session and you have that discussion, because it's about contract, so you go in and discuss that. We came out of executive session, we took a motion, we approved it, and we went on our merry way. And typically what would happen is the minutes would come before us, you know, our next meeting might not be for 2 weeks. Maybe the meeting lasted a lot longer, because passage of minutes was usually at the end. So we got a really late start or something, and we'd kick it off to the following meeting. And now you're talking 4 weeks or 6 weeks out, and the minutes come back and we're going to approve them, and everybody, you know, are there any questions on the minutes? Are there any additions, deletions, corrections? And we approve them. New city council, I had left, the other 4 of my members had left. We had new city council, new city manager, and the new city manager apparently didn't like the fact that Chuck had gotten these benefits. The big stickler for him was that we had a insurance, but not life insurance, long-term care.
Long-term disability.
And so we had paid for a long-term care disability plan for him. And he didn't like it, apparently. So he went back through the minutes to find out when did this happen. Couldn't find it. Opened up an investigation. Hired Joe McNeil. Joe McNeil comes in and does his investigation. Can't find it in the minutes. Joe talked to me and the other members of the council that were on board. We all said, we remember doing it, we remember taking the action, we don't know why it's not in the minutes. What I'm getting to is, minutes are important, and they need to be as correct as they can be. So Joe, at the public hearing where they were gonna make a decision on what to do, Joe says, well, Joe gave them the option. He said, look, here's what my investigation found. I found nothing in the minutes. You know, there were members of the council that said that they had taken this action, but there's no proof of that. And he said, under contract law, you know, you have the option of taking this away. And then he changed and he said, but under promissory estoppel, which is established in the state of Vermont, you have, if you can prove that a promise was made, that will satisfy the court. And he was giving them the out, but they didn't take it. So they took away the benefits. The next morning, Pietro Lynn files the lawsuit in federal court. And I remember calling up Pietro and saying, and all 4 out of the 5 of us were at that meeting, we all said we had taken this action. We don't know why it's not in the minutes. So, anyway, long story short, it was, I said to Pietro Lynn, this will never see the inside of the courtroom, and once the insurance company saw it, the evidence that it didn't go.
So the minutes are important.
And minutes are important, they're the history of your board.
If the board hadn't turned over and it had come up in review 6 months after the fact, and you realized that you had left something out of the minutes, but you've approved them, can the board amend them
Yes.
at that point? It's not once approved, they can never be
No,
relooked at.
in fact, there's nothing in the state law or in Robert's rules, either way, that talks about draft minutes. And that's what, when we tell people, when they say they can't maintain, they can't do this in 5 days, just put some draft minutes up.
Yeah, we
Just
put
say-
unapproved, that's what we put
Exactly.
unapproved, and then
Draft,
once the
yeah.
board approves, we take down the word unapproved.
Right, that's all you have to do, and if there's an amendment, as long as there's an action in a meeting, in an open meeting, that says the board moved to amend the June 6th meeting
Did you
minutes.
go back and actually change the June 6th meeting, or do the February meeting minutes that say you amended the June 6th meeting minutes? Is that your record? for both?
Well,
Or is it sort of an option?
that's a good question, I don't know,
Do both.
So you're gonna vote this.
Okay.
so.
I'm just gonna do a quick time check. We're a little more than halfway through our presentation and we have about 20 minutes.
All right, so executive session,
And you gotta get to the questions.
maybe not.
No, you have to get to the questions.
Executive session, what is it? It's a closed portion of the public meeting. When's it appropriate? Only if the business to be considered fits into one of 14 statutory categories. Only if the public body moves from an open session to executive session and indicates the reason. So you can't say our regular meeting's at 7 o'clock, but we're gonna start in an executive session at 6:30. You would have to say, our meeting is starting tonight at 6:30, we're gonna go immediately into executive session, and then we will come back for our regular meeting. So you have to be in an open meeting in order to be able to go into executive session. It's only for talk, not action, with one exception, real estate. So if you're dealing with a real estate option of some kind, that's the only one where you can actually take an action in an executive session. And one of the common ones we get with schools is they're about to fire somebody, and we fired them in executive session. Well, you can't do that. You can have the discussion about what you're gonna do in executive session, but you have to come out of executive session and take that action in an open meeting.
You don't have to discuss it again.
You don't necessarily have to discuss it.
Just announce
You
it.
just have to make the motion and it's.
So the reasons, the first section, and these are all, can be led with the words premature public knowledge will clearly place the public body. Mark, I know you know these probably pretty well as Joel, but these are about contracts, labor relations agreements, arbitration, mediation, grievances, etc., civil litigation or prosecution, and confidential attorney-client communications. You can, when you go into executive session, you can ask that your attorney come in with you, or anybody else that you need to have discussions with on that item, as long as it meets the test of this. We were having, we had a lawsuit for a zoning dispute in South Burlington, and we were going into we were being sued, we had this lawsuit filed, and we were going into executive session with our Steve Spitzel, who was our attorney. And I said, so Steve, what do you got? And he goes, I got good news and bad news. And I said, okay, what's the good news? And he says, we have two ways we can fight this. And I said, what's the bad news? He goes, you're gonna lose both. And I said, okay.
Which one?
Any objection from the board, go settle this somehow. So, you know, we've had numerous occasions where we had grievances that were filed. We had a police officer who had sexually molested his niece or something. And there is a provision that allows someone who has a grievance to request it being done in a public meeting. And this police officer requested it in a public meeting. And his hope was that he could intimidate this young lady. She was fantastic. She really held up well. We fired him. He went to labor relations and still got fired.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
Now, when you go into executive session, if you bring in individuals that are not from your board, which are not familiar with executive session rules, shouldn't you at that point remind them that anything discussed in executive session should not be discussed in the public unless it's part of the motion when you come out?
Correct.
Other than that, it should never be discussed in public.
Yes, there's nothing in the statutes or anything that say that, but that would be understood. And I think it would not be a bad, for someone that doesn't, we had one city councilor who the next morning, one of the city employees would show up at the city manager's office and tell them what happened in his executive session the night before. So, it just, you know, you get lots of cases, different things that happen. Next page. The other permissible reasons are negotiating or securing real estate, appointment, employment, evaluation, discipline, or dismissal of a public officer or employee. And really, this is the page that pertains mostly to schools, the appointment or employment, evaluations, et cetera, student academic records, exempt public records under the Public Record Act. And then the last two, well, the next to the last one, clear and imminent peril to public safety, has been there for years. But the last one was added just in recent years because of the nature of what was going on and the fact that the press kept insisting that they get a copy of the security plan. And so the legislature felt it was important to keep that out of sight. Next, you can meet by electronic means. If a member is participating remotely, they must identify him or herself when the meeting convenes, and they must be able to be heard and to hear and also be heard throughout the meeting. If a quorum is participating remotely, the agenda must designate a physical location where the public can attend and participate, and one member or designee must be physically present. Any vote that's not unanimous must be taken by roll, just to make sure you have who voted for what. Public participation, members of the public have a right to attend, to participate, and to help you enforce the law. Attend, obtaining meeting agendas, be notified directly, disability accommodations, to participate. This is written in the statutes, that a reasonable opportunity to express opinions on matters being considered subject to reasonable rules. The chair can make reasonable accommodations. For instance, we had for a public hearing on our $10 million operating budget, we might have 2 members of the public show up in a town of 15,000 people. 2 people show up for that discussion. But when we were going to discuss the leash law, we had 150 people show up, and 75 were for it and 75 against it, and everybody wanted to speak. So you have to give them.
How many had leashes on?
So we, as chair, I just set some reasonable rules. I said, there's a sign-up sheet in the back. We'll take them in order, and that also helps us with our minutes. But also, we gave them 2 minutes to speak, and we implored upon people not to say the same thing over and over and over again. But 3 hours later, we were still discussing it.
And still hearing the same thing over and over and over again.
Why do we comply? Meetings held without respecting the details of the law may be illegal, and the courts may regard any actions that were taken in those meetings as voidable. Illegal meetings offend our notions of openness, accountability, and democracy. In Vermont, the people rule, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly through their elected or appointed reps, but always with the benefit of public scrutiny. Next.
Back up.
The following persons can be charged with a misdemeanor and fined: a member of the public body who knowingly and intentionally violates the open meeting law, a person who knowingly and intentionally violates the open meeting law on behalf of another member of the public body, or a person who knowingly and intentionally participates in the wrongful exclusion of a person from a meeting. You can file with the Attorney General, or any aggrieved individual can bring suit in court asking for injunctive relief, declaratory judgment, and attorney's fees and costs. We haven't seen too many get that far. Next. Enforcement. Essentially, written notice to the public body by the aggrieved individual or the Attorney General alleging what the specific violation and requesting a specific cure. Public bodies, public response within 10 calendar days acknowledging the violation and stating intent to cure, or stating that no violation occurred, so no cure is necessary. The public body's cure, if it acknowledges a violation, must be addressed within 14 calendar days. And an aggrieved individual's recourse, if unsatisfied with the actions, can file in Superior Court within 1 year after the meeting. Is that it?
Quick
Yes.
question on that one, so if we had since we don't meet regularly, monthly or less frequently, it would be likely if we had an open meeting
You'd
law
have a special
complaint,
meeting.
we'd need to have a special meeting.
Yes.
We have 7.5 minutes. Several of the questions related to well, me. And
Of course they do.
and whether it's appropriate for the chair, lawful for the chair, to prepare information and provide it to the board members in advance of the meeting, sometimes including motions that I or anybody could present to the board at a meeting. And the one qualification here is assume in your answer that that's it. Nobody uses reply all, nobody engages in discussion of it. Is that a fair presentation of the question?
No.
No.
Well, okay, go ahead.
I'd just like
That's
the answer.
that's my question.
Okay.
Well, my piece is, what I disagree with the way you phrased the question as opposed to the way I did, was there's an assumption that nobody replies. And it is very concerning to me that there's extensive board discussion of matters that may be coming before the board, where someone is putting out their discussion and their ideas, and if I'm gonna remain an ethical, responsible board member, I shouldn't reply, yet there's stuff I disagree with profoundly. So it's first come, first served in terms of shaping the business of the organization. So I would like your opinion on that, because I feel like it's not okay for one person to put forth extensive analysis and discussion in an email format, and that should be reserved for board if we're going to operate with the spirit of the law.
It's a great question, and I talked it over a little bit with our general counsel in the office today. And our conclusion was that it's probably legal, that one person is sending information, you're not engaging the whole board in a discussion. There's no reply all happening, so that's okay under the open meeting law. But I understand your concern, and I think you'd all want to be careful about the appearance of information being distributed, maybe side conversations happening, even if it's each individually back to the sender, not the whole group discussing. You probably, you can kind of engage in a meeting eventually if there's a lot
If
of
that were to
that
happen,
happening.
even one-on-one with a quorum,
Yep,
then you're up the
that's
creek.
right, that's what we refer to as a
It's-
serial
and
meeting.
it's hard
There's
to
a lot
keep track of that.
conversation about that.
The other point to remember, I think, is if you are gonna send stuff out, it has to be stuff that's available to the public when they show up.
Sure.
So
Always.
that if you send out 5 documents, there should be a stack of 5 documents here for the public if they show up.
So if Joel sends 5 documents on an agenda item, is it equally okay for me to send my own 5 documents on that same agenda item?
See, that's
Now
where
you're
it
starting,
gets-
now you're starting to get
Right.
into the area.
Exactly.
So that becomes
Exactly.
the first come, first served piece of it.
That's why it's problematic.
What happens, take board members out, but put our management team in. In today's agenda, for example, we have memos providing us information about issues accompanied by motions. Is there any distinction under the law for?
I don't think there is. Again, I think it's probably legal under the open meeting law, but you want to look at how that appears to the public, what effect that's having on the rest of your board, if they're feeling like that's a preemptive discussion or a preemptive, someone's getting a say when others are not. You may want to narrow the amount of information that you're sending out that way and save it for the meeting.
Well, for me, the biggest problem we face is the infrequency of our meetings
Yep.
and the crowded nature of our agendas.
Yes.
And we talk about some, sometimes pretty complex issues.
Yeah.
And if we don't have information provided in advance and we're operating on a very narrow time frame, we're not gonna
So
reach
you
good,
may just
we may reach decisions, but they won't be well informed.
You may want to consider filtering that in some other way, that information, so that it's maybe, I don't want to say it's biased, but it's representing.
A motion presents.
Representing the will of the board and what information they need to feel prepared. And it is something boards struggle with constantly, is they would love to have some of these pre-discussions, because they've got so many things on their agenda and so much information to absorb that they want it in advance.
Well, we've had
But when you
people,
start kind of engaging that, you're starting the conversation
You're
almost.
starting the conversation.
and we've had people say, well, you know, can't we use Google Docs and just put put a Google Docs out and have people just, no,
No.
you're now starting to have that discussion.
That's not it.
And the public doesn't have access to that, and it all comes, I always say to people, the public has a right to know, and how you get there, that's what this is. It really, if you think about it, there's a lot in this presentation, but if you really think about it in terms of the public has a right to know, they have a right to attend, and they have a right to participate. And that's really where it comes down.
So I've had 22 years on a board, and I can't tell you how many times I walked into a meeting thinking I knew where I stood on issue, and after discussion, I changed my opinion. And when I did trainings with school boards in my next role, I stressed the whole value of the board, as opposed to like a vote, right, is the discussion element. It's the bringing together different views that makes the decision stronger. When I've now moved into this management role where I'm preparing for a board in a different way, sort of the superintendent principal type role. And when I look at what we do, Mark, Bobby, Joe, and I, in preparing agenda and materials, I look at, we spend a lot of time framing an issue, often having a recommendation. Only very rarely with the very specific issue do we ask for a specific motion. Usually we just have information, often frame a recommendation, give it to the board so they can read it ahead of time. They then discuss it in public and decide whether to accept that recommendation, modify it, send us back, do nothing. That's all happening in an open session. So to me, it feels like a distinction between, as a board member, trying to frame a discussion for other board members, or management trying to frame a discussion for the board to hold in public session. But I wasn't sure I heard you concur.
I actually agree with what you just said. I mean, I think it's really, well, from your standpoint, the discussion's happening at the board.
We aren't talking to the board ahead of time, we're letting them
There's
read it ahead
nothing
of
wrong
time.
with giving them the information ahead of time. There's nothing wrong with doing that, providing the information. And it could include recommendation of staff. But I think if you start, I
But
think
we're not
you
the
need to be
decision
careful.
makers at that point,
Exactly.
we're
Right.
handing the decision over. If I was a board
And
member.
you're not a board member.
Right, if I was a board member giving my recommendation, I'm starting to have a discussion.
I agree with
If I'm a
that.
staff member giving a recommendation, I'm framing a discussion that I don't get a decision
say
on.
on
From if I'm a board member doing it, to me, there's a big distinction between providing information and taking a position. And I get, that becomes very gray.
It does.
But if a board member is providing information, I see that as one thing. If they are taking a position, I see that as very, very, very different.
And you wanna be careful, because, I mean, you know, Chris and I and my chief of staff, we don't, we're not a board as such, but our chief of staff will prepare, let's say, a press release, and he sends it to Chris and I, and we each weigh in on it. That's one thing. But if you
But you're not
started
a board.
doing that with a board, where you send out something and ask the board member, you know, what are your thoughts on this, add, you know, edit it, then you've got a problem. And I'm not saying that's what you're doing,
Yeah.
but
That segues to a question I had from early in your presentation that I held, because I'm a rule follower. You talked about committees, and one of the things that, or meetings, the definition of meeting for a committee or the body as a whole, it doesn't include, the bullets say is staff work assignments. At the last meeting, the board designated Joel and I to complete a specific task together. We were to get information and bring it back to the board. Did our work together require a meeting, or is it okay for a board to designate one or two board members to complete a particular work task, the outcome of which is coming back here for discussion?
I don't see a problem with that.
Just.
The way
I
you
just
said
wanted-
it.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that.
And as a non-lawyer, but also from a legal standpoint, I think it all depends on what's basically on the page. I mean, I don't know.
Totally understand, it depends.
People will offer a lot of discussion to us, and then we find out that wasn't quite how it happened, and I'm not suggesting that's the case here, but, based on what you just said, I would say that there's not an issue.
There were several other questions, but I have to tell you, we have to get out of here in 2 hours, and most of the business of this body is sitting in front of us.
I would be happy to follow up in writing with the questions that you sent. I'll do my best to respond to them. There will be a lot of consult your own legal counsel. This is a gray area of the law.
It
And just to
depends,
address
yeah.
one, it depends,
Yeah.
to address one big area, I'll say the open meeting law does not address procedure.
Right.
So as far as following Robert's rules,